I have been, the prophets have been a mad, ridiculous obsession for 20 odd years, really. It started when I had a small group of students who used to meet with me. Well, actually, it wasn't that small. We got to sort of 25 who would meet with me very early on a Wednesday morning to do hard stuff. It was mostly apologetics and worldviews and that kind of stuff. And they just wanted to be stretched as much as they could. And they needed lots of coffee and toast. And then they decided they wanted to do some Bible stuff. And so what was the hardest bit of the Bible? And the general consensus was Revelation or Ezekiel. And we get some stuff on Revelation. Let's go for Ezekiel. Was Andy part of that, Gordon? I think he might have been. I think he may have been. Yeah. That was a long time back. So, yeah. A very long time back. I first met Gordon in Vienna in 1992. So that's 25 years ago we first met. That's
when we first met.
Yeah, isn't that right?
Andy wouldn't have been part of
No, he was a little bit later than that, yeah. So I did Ezekiel. I just fell in love with Ezekiel, and he's never let go of me. And I keep going back to Ezekiel, but then it quickly spread to all the prophets. And I've been working in media for longer, and now finally realised I've got to bring the two of these together. Can't keep these on parallel tracks any longer, especially when my work is about relationship between the media and the Bible. And I keep touching on the prophets. Any conversation you have with me will touch on the prophets at some point or other, I think. Finally beginning to integrate them properly. So we'll see what happens from here, but I'm quite excited about some things that are developing. The outline is in the app, of course. If you need that, it's significantly different. Well, not significantly. It is somewhat different now. Trouble with preparing an outline 4 months in advance of doing something is you don't really fully know where you're going with it. So you take a bit of a guess, and then when you actually come to preparing the detail, you discover that the reality is a little different. And that actually there isn't time to get through all of this stuff. So we'll see. We'll go fast. Firstly, to think about the calling of the prophets. The prophets' their fundamental vocation was to represent God, to speak on behalf of God, to say, you got that famous phrase right throughout the prophets that comes again and again, this is what the Lord says. This is what Yahweh says. And sometimes that's used as an introductory formula to a prophetic oracle, a prophetic speech. Sometimes it comes at the end. You've got this announcement of judgment or whatever, and it concludes with declares the Lord. And what these men were saying was what God said to them to pass on to the people. And their responsibility was to represent God to the people and to announce his word to them. And the faithful prophets, the prophets that were validated, were those who spoke in line with the Mosaic covenant. And they spoke in line with the Torah, with what had already been revealed by God. And that's fundamentally what they were doing, was to point people back to that. So there's a lot of commonality between the way the prophets were handling the Torah, the teaching of the law, and the way that a preacher will handle texts within a modern context. Though I'm not sure that I would want to draw an equivalence between the prophets and preachers in quite that way, but there's certainly some common ground there. So that's their fundamental calling, is to represent God. Their particular function was to call people back to the covenant, therefore, because they were announcing, this is what the terms of the covenant are. And you'll be familiar, I'm sure, from the end of Leviticus and the end of Deuteronomy, two very significant passages announcing curses for those who break the covenant, or on the nation for breaking the covenant. Death, destruction, disease, destitution, deportment, and various other things beginning with D, disease. And then a series of blessings for those and for the nation as a whole for living within the covenant. So they had to announce failure again and again. That we think of the prophets as being gloomy and miserable and full of judgment. And my wife would tell you that's why Tony loves the prophets. She maintains that I love films that are miserable. I love parts of the Bible that are miserable. I love music that's miserable. I'm never happier than when I'm being miserable. The best film I've ever seen, Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. I watched it 8 times in 2 weeks, and it made me cry every time. This is the perfect film. So she might be right. She might be right. I'm not going to say. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here and to make you all miserable. So they were to expose the failure of the people to keep the covenant, to say, you have broken the terms of the covenant, and therefore these covenant curses that Moses spelt out, these are coming your way. And so Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, in their book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, which is brilliant, talk about them as covenant enforcement mediators. They're kind of like God's guard dogs. So here is the territory that is marked out by the covenant. And to live in the covenant means to live in this territory that God has marked out. And if you start straying to the edge of that, or if you step over the bounds of what God has set, these guard dogs will bark at you and say, get back in line. Or you will not just be barked at, you will be bitten. And so they're enforcing the covenant. They're guard dogs announcing where the limits are to living in relationship with God. And then they also present possible futures. We sometimes often we fall into thinking that the prophets are about predicting the future. John made several references to prophets this morning in terms of New Testament fulfilling prophecy. But the bulk of what the prophets were saying was not actually about speaking specifically about this is what's going to happen. When David first wrote Psalm 69 and 109, he wasn't specifically thinking about the future, but he was a prophet. He was writing about his situation, and then that has a further applicability. How much he saw of the future, we don't know. Clearly, there are passages that are very explicitly looking to the future, and there are many passages that are about the present that then have new levels, new dimensions of meaning. There's a couple of horizons to the prophets. A friend of mine, Andrew Page, talks about a prophetic telescope. So the prophets, they can focus the telescope very close on what's in front of them, and then suddenly they refocus, and then they're focusing on a distant horizon that looks like a hill in the distance, looks very hazy perhaps, difficult to make out the details. But that's suddenly where they're looking, and they switch from one to the other, often seamlessly. And sometimes they're even looking at both at once. So the prophets announce judgment that will come as a consequence of whether the people are staying in this territory or not. So if you step outside of the territory of the covenant, you will get bitten. You will face God's judgment. But on the other hand, if you stay within the covenant, then these prophets roll over and want to play because they will announce God's blessing. The blessing of living within the covenant, the joy of living in an intimate relationship with God. That is what they're calling people back to. And so their words about the future are generally conditional. There are exceptions to that, but they're generally conditional, saying, if you do this, this will happen. If you do that, this will happen. But of course they know perfectly well that these people are not going to turn very often. And then you get somebody like Jonah who goes off to Nineveh and says, 40 more days and this city will be overturned. There's not a clue there that this is conditional. The Ninevites repent. From the lowest to the greatest, even the king sits in ashes, repenting. And of course, judgment is averted, God relents. And Jonah is furious because he didn't announce this prophecy as being conditional in any way. And he said, I knew you were going to do this. I knew you're a gracious, compassionate God, and So not every prophet liked the blessing coming. Jonah perhaps is not the model prophet in some ways. Okay, so that's the prophets and the prophets' vocation. Secondly, the calling of the media. What is the calling of the media? Do the media have a calling? In particular, do they have some kind of calling from God? What is the human vocation, the fundamental human vocation? We're made in the image and likeness of God in Genesis chapter 1. The likeness of God means that in some ways we reflect some of God's capacities and capabilities. There are some aspects of being, many aspects of being human that are reflections of being made in the image of God. We are rational, relational, spiritual, creative. We work. We are moral beings. We have dignity. All sorts of things that come from being made in the image of God. Not necessarily spelled out for us in any detail at all in those early chapters of Genesis, but we begin to put the pieces of that together as we go through Scripture. But human beings are made like God at some level. The image of God was also about representing God. So in the same way as the image of a god in a pagan temple represented that god, and the priest probably thought that in some sense that the image was the god. There were various rituals for the god to inhabit this image. The human being was to form the same function. It was to be like the image of a god in a temple. The creation, the original creation, was a cosmic temple with human beings being the living images of God, representing God within the created order, managing the created order on God's behalf. Not static bits of wood, but living, acting images, representations of God. And so we were to work the garden, to take care of it, to extend it, to subdue the whole earth. And that vocation of representing God still stands. That's what we are created for. We are still God's image bearers, despite the fall. So Tom Wright, very insightful British theologian, says, God is the working through humans God. And human authorities, whether they know it or not, have the noble vocation of bringing God's wise order into the world. He's talking about the political dimension there in particular, that any human ruler is exercising one of the fundamental requirements of human beings to bring order to the world. And when a political institution does that well, then it is reflecting the image of God well. When it does it badly, then it is not reflecting the image of God well, and it's reflecting our fallen human nature. But the reality of everything that we do, all of our endeavours, whether they be creative or political or intellectual, they are all both reflecting the image of God within us and our brokenness and our fallenness and our rebellion. As Solzhenitsyn said, I think it was in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, he said, the line between good and evil runs right through every human heart. And it runs right through every human endeavour, through every human book, through every film that we make, through every institution that we build, through every community that we try to form. But we are to represent God. And so the media, representing the image of God, the creativity of God, and bringing that to life, whether they recognize that or not. And of course, most people in the media don't recognize that. Nevertheless, they are exercising that fundamental human vocation of manifesting something of the image of God in the world. Though also the rebellion of God is coming out there. Secondly, one of the functions of the media, at least in part, this is not the function of the whole of the media. A lot of the media, of course, is about entertainment. But at least part of the function of the media is to speak truth to power, is to do what the writer on the prophets, Walter Brueggemann, calls it presenting an alternative consciousness to the dominant consciousness. There is a dominant consciousness within society. There's a predominant way of thinking and acting and behaving. Peter Berger, the American sociologist, talks about plausibility structures. There are certain things built into the way that a culture operates that make some ways of behaving and thinking completely automatic. We just don't question them. And other ways of thinking and behaving literally unthinkable. It's too far out of the plausibility structure for us to even contemplate it. And so the function of the media is partly to present an alternative consciousness. Here's Tom Wright again. He says, this was from a speech he gave at the Church and Media Conference last year. He says, the task of the media in our world today is to combine the philosopher, the poet, and the dramatist. He's talking about those from the ancient world, from the classical world, to tell the truth in the public arena, to raise the awkward questions and remind both rulers and ruled of dimensions of the problems which might otherwise be swept under the official rug. They are to challenge and to present a different way of looking at things. And that maybe applies more to some parts of the media than others. So a documentary filmmaker is very often going to be challenging the standard, the official line from a government or a corporation or from a celebrity. There's some spin being presented to us, and a documentary maker will get underneath that and say, this is the real story of what's going on. News journalism is about exposing what's the real truth of the situation here, and of saying to a politician, but this is inconsistent with what you said before. You're misusing your power, or whatever. Fundamental function of factual media, at least. But often it's part of the entertainment media too, where they will explore alternative ways of thinking and behaving that will challenge something of the status quo. Something that isn't on the outline but is important to say is the media's failure to do this. So if the media's vocation is to fulfill the human calling of representing God and of speaking truth to power and so on, a lot of the media, a lot of the time, fails to do that. It doesn't exercise that prophetic function of presenting an alternative consciousness, but it reinforces the dominant consciousness. It just plays along with the system. So it needs to attract audiences. It needs to sell advertising. And so it just churns out stuff, maybe brilliantly creative, insightful stuff nevertheless, but still it just reinforces the predominant views that are around rather than challenging the ideas. But media at its best is a challenging thing. Now, so there's the prophets on the one hand, media on the other hand. How do these connect together? I think that there are a number of themes that are of common interest to both the prophets and the media. First, some values that I think they both keep circling around. They're very central to, two of them especially are very central to the prophets. And all three of them keep coming up in the media. Well, I think they are central to the media. First is truth and lies. The prophets have a very high regard for truth, obviously, because they are God's spokespeople. And the prophets are saying, this is what God says. They're announcing truth. They dismiss, they announce judgment on the people for their failure to hold on to truth, for the adoption of lies within a society. Read the announcement at the beginning of Hosea 4, for instance, which talks about the land being full of bloodshed and of lies. So truth and lies are hugely important to truth and deception, hugely important to the prophets, but they also are to the media too. We think justifiably, rightly, a lot of the time that the media is postmodern in its orientation and has a low regard for truth. But actually all the discussion that we've had about post-truth in the last few months is fascinating, because while there has been a lot of post-truth stuff within the media, a lot of what's been in the mainstream media in particular has been dismay over the post-truth situation. What are we going to do about the fact that... Do I name names? Yeah. What are we going to do about the fact that there seems to be a president on the other side of the pond who doesn't seem to have a very high regard for truth and says things that don't necessarily tally with each other, without wishing to get too political. It's happened over in the UK too. We had our referendum over Brexit last year, and it was very clear that a lot of the discussion about that centred around emotional sound bites, not around what was actually true and what was false. And some of the claims, particularly on one side, but on both sides, but some of the claims were admitted to be false as soon as the referendum had been won. And were known to be false before that point. So there was a lot of dismay about that. So actually the media still holds on to truth. Though not entirely. There's still a lot of lying and deception. A lot of narrative media will tell stories about people who get themselves into difficulties because of their failure to hold on to truth. It's not that the media is constantly upholding truth for us, but it is there. It's because it's deep in the human heart. We're made for truth because we're made in the image of God. And so it takes actually quite a lot for us to lose that and suppress that completely. Yes, Paul says that we suppressed the truth in our wickedness in Romans chapter 1. Of course we have. But it doesn't mean we've abandoned it completely. It doesn't mean there's no truth within our society. And truth and deception is still an issue of great concern to the media. I won't show you a clip, but a famous scene from A Few Good Men with Jack Nicholson saying, "You can't handle the truth," because Tom Cruise's lawyer character is pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to try and say what the truth of the situation is. And all there has been is lies from the military establishment. And then finally, you can't handle the truth. But that's what we want. And of course, that moment in this film, everybody says, yes, give us the truth. That's what we want. And we can handle it, even if it's uncomfortable. Secondly, goodness and badness, what in biblical terms is called righteousness and unrighteousness. But again, a huge concern to the media. This is 12 Years a Slave, written and directed by Steve McQueen from 3-4 years ago, with about slavery in the United States, with Chiwetel Ejiofor, brilliant performance by him as Solomon Northup, a guy who had been free and yet ended up being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And what's her name? Lupita Nyong'o being pawed by Michael Fassbender's slave owner. And we're meant to feel the outrage of that. Steve McQueen is not making a film about slavery just to entertain us. In fact, for him, entertaining us is secondary, because he's trying to say this is a disgrace that this kind of thing ever happened. And we could look at film after film where filmmakers have got a passion for some deep immorality within society. Or it may be on a very personal level. The moral failure of Richard Gere's character in brilliant, underrated film called Arbitrage from a few years ago. He's a financial wheeler dealer who makes compromises and gets himself in a terrible mess, or lines and unfaithful. Countless films that revolve around issues of morality and immorality, and the mess that people get themselves into as a result. One of the long-running soaps in the UK is EastEnders. Former executive director of EastEnders, John York, gave a speech to clergy in one of the dioceses in the UK about 10, maybe even 15 years ago now, about EastEnders. Because people say, these are just thoroughly immoral people. And he said, but EastEnders is a profoundly moral piece of storytelling, because these people do bad things and then they pay for it. And they may not pay for it tomorrow. They won't pay for it in easy, quick resolutions, but 6 months, 12 months, 2 years down the line, what they have done will catch up with them. Interesting, isn't it? That our society cannot let go of issues of goodness and badness, righteousness, unrighteousness, morality and immorality. And then there's beauty and ugliness. The prophets don't deal with this quite so much. They do present a picture of the beauty of living in relationship with God. You could say maybe that's a moral kind of beauty. But actually, Isaiah, for instance, presents this beautiful picture of a restored creation. And on the other hand, there are horrific pictures of the desolation of judgment. Think of Isaiah 34-35, where he's painting this picture of complete desolation because of the judgment that God is bringing, where there's no life, there's just jackals wandering through the ruins, dust blowing through, an odd owl perching on a bit of standing masonry, and no life, people living in fear. It's a post-apocalyptic image that could be straight from the road, or something like that. So there's lots of those kinds of images within the prophets, but also within the media, presentations of beauty. I mentioned Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life, utterly beautiful film. But with some of the ugliness of human existence making itself felt as well, death in particular, profound ugliness of existence. Okay, so some of the key values: truth, deception, goodness, badness, beauty, ugliness, but also some key themes that keep coming up. In particular, questions of social justice and specific aspects of morality. The prophets have got a deep concern about social justice, because the way a society functions is a reflection of how that society is in relationship with God. If the relationship with God is right, if this community is living within the territory of the covenant, they should be experiencing the blessing of God and the blessing of living good lives with each other. It should be functioning well. So it's a just and a fair and a beautiful society. But when they begin to step out of the covenant, when they begin to break the terms of what God has set out for them, then injustice comes in, and you've got exploitation, greed and violence and everything that comes along with the fall. So both the prophets and the media are concerned about money and power. I wish we had time to look at clips for all of these, but we simply haven't, so just move swiftly on. Injustice itself, not just the use and misuse of money and power, but specific instances of exploitation, oppression, or whatever. So the just railing, just angry about injustice and saying this is not how it should be. He could so easily have said this is not how it should be for people made in the image of God. But he didn't. He appealed to other things. But yeah. And then questions of sex as well. Of course, money, sex, and power, the big three that keep coming up within the media. They're there within the prophets too. One of the metaphors that the prophets use again and again is the metaphor of adultery and prostitution. It goes back to Moses, who first suggested the idea of being unfaithful to God as kind of like adultery. But Hosea in particular picked this up in a very profound way because God called him to marry a prostitute and to have children of prostitution. And the language is quite strong in Hebrew. Ezekiel, may have a chance to look at Ezekiel 16 a little bit later, one of the most shocking chapters of the whole of the Bible, if not the most shocking. Well, that and Ezekiel 23, I'm not sure whether one trumps the other or not. But incredibly shocking stuff, portraying God's people as prostitutes because of their unfaithfulness. But back to Hosea. So he marries a prostitute who's unfaithful to him. He has these children. It's only clear that the first is his child. The second and third may or may not be. The text is ambivalent. She goes off, and God says to her, "Go and woo your wife again. Go and win her back." as I'm winning my people back. And God announces the end of the relationship. He announces the termination of the covenant. And then, completely unmotivated, says, but I will restore it. I'll win her back. This is finished. This is an end. I'm not going any further. But I'll start again. And it's a death and resurrection motif that comes again and again in the prophets. You know, in Luke 24, this is an aside now, but you know, in Luke 24, when Jesus is on the road to Emmaus, and so beginning with Moses, and it goes right through to talk about how the Old Testament talks about how you should have known that the Messiah was going to die and rise again. Why didn't you know this from Scripture? Have you ever scratched your head and thought, where is this in the Bible? I mean, the sign of Jonah, but is that it? Really? Is that all the Scripture? But it's right there through the prophets, the whole of the death and resurrection of the people of God. They are destroyed by God. The covenant is terminated, and then it's a new start. It's there from beginning to end. It's just not in explicit passages. It seems to me that the media is also concerned about judgment in very profound ways, as of course are the prophets. We're out of time if we're going to have any time for questions. So I'm not going to say anything about the interest in the nations in the prophets and contemporary media. They have somewhat different views of that, but that's okay. Religion. There's a lot within the media about problematic religion, about corrupt religion. Religious hypocrisy is constantly being exposed by the media, as it is in the prophets. There's a very shared agenda there. I haven't got time to talk about that. Very briefly, let me just talk about the prophets as models for media communication. Because I think it's not just that they have interesting common themes, but that they have some common approaches as well. And that the more that the media reflect some of these approaches, the better it does, I think. And I think we need to reflect on some of these. We haven't got time to talk about them in any detail at all, but just to give you this one comment from Quentin Schultz's book. Sorry, there should be an E on the end of his surname. This is from Communicating for Life. He says, the perennial task of the prophet is understanding the contours of the present in the light of God's wisdom. Understanding the contours of the present in the light of God's wisdom. So thinking back to what I was saying about Brueggemann's categories of the dominant consciousness and alternative consciousness, the prophet, whether that be a biblical prophet, a Christian prophet, or a media prophet, should be reflecting on what is the dominant consciousness, where are the failings of that, and therefore what should be the alternative consciousness that should be presented. And the Christian in particular should be doing that obviously in the light of God's wisdom. So I think the prophets and the media, as well as sharing themes, they share particular perspectives and approaches, and it is that dominant and alternative consciousness thing. Here is a quote from Brueggemann's classic book, The Prophetic Imagination. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. So that perspective of trying to find a better way of living is at the heart of all of our creative endeavours, isn't it? That we're trying to, what is the best way of us living? What does it really mean for a human being to flourish? And that may be a narrative about a relationship between two people, or about a family, or a community, or whatever, but it's what is the best way of living? And the media, the narratives that do that best are those that challenge the dominant consciousness the most, it seems to me. So some of their approaches, powerful imagery, I think I wrote graphic imagery on the outline. It's not necessarily graphic, but it is powerful imagery. Right through the prophets, from beginning to end, the image after image after image. But this is their stock in trade. This is the basic tool that they have. is presenting these extraordinary word pictures, presenting metaphors. The dew disappearing in the latter chapters of Hosea. The dew disappearing in the morning is like the disappearing of my people's love, is the gist of what he's saying there. Or the image he presents earlier on of a band of priests lying in waiting by the side of the road for somebody to come along to attack. Were the priests literally doing that, or is this a picture of the way that the priests were exploiting people? The image lived out by Hosea in his marriage. Isaiah's images of eagles soaring, of weighing the nations in balances, of washing wool so that it's whiter than snow, of shelter standing in the middle of a field of melons, kind of isolated and all on its own. Just extraordinary range of images that they use. I mentioned Ezekiel 16 now. I think we don't have time to read it. It is a very shocking chapter, especially in Hebrew. The words Ezekiel uses are not words that I would want to translate into English and use in church or anywhere else. And he's not afraid to use that strong language. But it presents this picture of Jerusalem as a baby that has been born and just thrown into a field, discarded. The cord's not even cut. It's not been washed. Just left out in the sun to die. And speaking on behalf of God, says, I passed by and rescued you. Actually doesn't mention washing, but rescued you and looked after you. And then later, when I saw that you were old enough for love, I washed you and made you beautiful. So this extraordinary picture of an abandoned baby that's rescued and then beautified by the rescuer, given beautiful things and fine robes and jewelry, and then twists it all around and says, but you use these things. You use these things that I gave you to pay your lovers. And then this shocking language about exposing herself on every corner, in every public square, to anyone who passes by. And this graphic announcement of judgment, that I will strip you bare in the sight of your lover so that they will see your nakedness and bring on you the judgment of prostitutes. Very powerful imagery. It's very persuasive language. The prophets are constantly using extremely persuasive language, the parallelism, the setting two things side by side to reinforce their points, the structures they use to drive home their message. Constant use of irony. Irony is very big again within the media, of course. And then lots of unexpected connections, it seems to me. The prophets give you this image that seems to come from nowhere and then connect it with this profound failure to live in relationship with God. And you think, at first you think, that's an interesting connection to make. And then you realize just kind of what it does to you. The media don't necessarily do a great deal of making unexpected connections, but we need to be. We need to be able to look at the media and say, that's being articulated there in this film, that's reflecting something of what God says here, or that's going counter to what God says here, but constantly making the connection between the Bible and culture in order to make people aware of the fact that they have. It's not just that they're living out of the territory of what it means to live in a relationship with God. They don't even know what that territory is. They don't even know that territory exists. And to say to them, you're pursuing meaning in life. You're trying to shape your life based on something that is inadequate, something that will fail you. But there is only one sure foundation. There is only one way to discover the happiness, the peace, the love, the freedom, the joy that you're looking for. And that is in shalom, that is in this intimate relationship with God.